A red dirt track runs straight towards a low ridge of saltbush and mulga scrub, unbroken except for a single wire fence and a weathered metal sign bolted to a star picket. To anyone driving past on the Stewart Highway north of Port Augusta, it looks like standard pastoral leasehold, identical to hundreds of thousands of square kilometers of semi-arid grazing country stretching across the interior. It is not pastoral land. Behind that wire begins a continuous restricted zone measuring 122,000 square kilometers, an area roughly the size of North Korea, excised from public access since 1947 and managed under federal defense legislation that authorizes immediate arrest for unauthorized entry. What is remarkable is not simply the scale of the exclusion, but how quietly these boundaries sit on the official map, passed every day by road freight and regional traffic without a second glance. How did so much of the continent become formally off-limits to its own citizens? And what remains buried or active behind those perimeter lines? In this series, we examine the most restricted ground in every state and territory across the country, from a former atomic proving ground in the offshore waters of Western Australia, where visitors still face strict time limits due to residual gamma radiation, down to the single most isolated military intelligence facility hidden in the red sand dunes of the Northern Territory. For decades, the standard assumption among travelers and mapmakers was that the continent's vast interior was simply open, unpopulated space, defined only by distance and natural barriers. That assumption made practical sense when early trigonometric surveys drew neat grids across pastoral districts and treated the arid zones as uniform tracts of crown land. But the official cartography concealed a deliberate secondary layer. Beginning during the Second World War and accelerating through the Cold War, state and Commonwealth authorities systematically closed off enormous swathes of country for weapons testing, high-security communications, sovereign resource stockpiles, and hazardous industrial quarantines. Number 10 on the register takes us to the southern coastline of Western Australia and the abandoned settlement of Wittenoom, situated within the Shire of Ashburton in the Pilbara region. For decades, Wittenoom was a working mining township supporting the extraction of chrysidolite, commonly known as blue asbestos, from the surrounding gorges. Between 1937 and 1966, the operation milled roughly 160,000 tons of blue asbestos fibers. The tailing dumps left behind exceeded 3 million tons, and the fine, needle-like mineral fibers were routinely distributed throughout the town site as gravel for school playgrounds, residential driveways, and road base. Because inhaled chrysidolite fibers cause mesothelioma, asbestosis, and lung cancer with latency periods spanning several decades, the public health crisis eventually forced the state government to phase out municipal services. In 2007, the Western Australian government took the extraordinary administrative step of formally degazetting the town, stripping it from official maps and removing all road signage from regional highways. In 2022, the State Parliament passed the Wittenoom Closure Act, enabling the compulsory acquisition of all remaining private freehold properties to allow complete demolition of remaining structures. Today, the entire 50,000-hectare area remains classified as severely contaminated and permanently off-limits to the public, guarded by warning signs under the Contaminated Sites Act 2003, where simply disturbing the topsoil generates a lethal airborne hazard. Number 9 shifts to the offshore waters of the Pilbara, specifically the Montebello Islands, an archipelago of more than 250 low-lying limestone islands situated roughly 130 kilometers off the coast of Dampier. On the surface, the turquoise lagoons and coral reefs appear to be an undisturbed marine park. But beneath that exterior lies the ground zero of Britain's first atomic weapons test. On the 3rd of October 1952, the British military detonated a 25-kiloton plutonium bomb, codenamed Operation Hurricane, inside the hull of a surplus naval frigate, HMS Plym, anchored off Trimouille Island. The explosion entirely vaporized the vessel, leaving an 8-meter-deep crater on the seabed and scattering radioactive metal fragments across the surrounding reefs. 4 years later, in May and June 1956, 2 further nuclear explosions were conducted under Operation Mosaic on Trimouille and Alpha Islands, including a 98-kiloton blast that remains the largest nuclear explosion ever detonated on or near Australian territory. While the islands were declared a conservation park in 1992, the ground on Trimouille and Alpha Islands contains residual cesium-137 and americium-241. The Australian Radiation Protection and Nuclear Safety Agency enforces strict visitor guidelines. Landing is permitted only during daylight hours, camping is banned, and visitors are legally prohibited from disturbing the soil or remaining on the radioactive test sites for more than 1 hour per day. Number 8 brings us to the southwestern corner of the continent and the deep Jarrah forests of the Darling Scarp, approximately 70 kilometers south of Perth. Here lies the Garden Island Naval Facility, officially designated HMAS Stirling, occupying the entirety of a 4,000-hectare limestone barrier island on Cockburn Sound. Established under defence planning in 1978, the base houses the Royal Australian Navy's fleet of Collins-class diesel-electric submarines. Access to the island is restricted to authorised defence personnel via a guarded 600-metre causeway connecting to the mainland at Point Peron. Waters surrounding the perimeter form a permanent maritime exclusion zone enforced under the Defence Act 1903. Behind the security gates, the complex supports advanced electronic warfare maintenance, torpedo workshops, and acoustic signature ranges. Under bilateral submarine deployment agreements, the facility is undergoing multi-billion-dollar infrastructural upgrades to establish Submarine Rotational Force West, accommodating continuous rotations of nuclear-powered attack submarines. Because the deep water channels of Cockburn Sound provide direct access to the Indian Ocean without passing civilian radar checkpoints, the naval base remains one of the most strictly secured and closely surveilled maritime territories on the western seaboard. Number 7 moves east into the red sand dune fields of the Great Victoria Desert, approximately 1,000 kilometres northwest of Adelaide, where the Maralinga testing ground sits across 3,300 square kilometres of arid plain. Between 1956 and 1963, the British government carried out 7 major atmospheric nuclear explosions at Maralinga and Emu Field, followed by more than 600 minor trials designed to test weapon components under non-nuclear detonation. These minor trials, particularly the Vixen series, burned and scattered approximately 22 kilograms of toxic plutonium-239 across the desert floor. The plutonium was broken into microscopic insoluble particles and dispersed across hundreds of square kilometers of open ground. Because plutonium-239 has a radioactive half-life of 24,100 years, the contamination permanently altered the landscape. Successive cleanup programs, concluding with an extensive Commonwealth remediation project between 1996 and 2000, excavated more than 350,000 cubic meters of contaminated topsoil and buried it in deep trenches sealed with meters of clean earth and heavy limestone caps. In 2014, full freehold title to 3,126 square kilometers was returned to the Maralinga Jaruja traditional owners, but major forward sections including the Taranaki blast site remain permanently restricted, where digging, camping, or the removal of ground material carries heavy federal penalties. Number 6 leads north into the tropical savannas of the Pine Creek geosyncline in the Northern Territory, roughly 120 kilometers south of Darwin, where the Rum Jungle uranium and copper mine left an enduring environmental exclusion zone. Commencing operations in 1954 to supply uranium concentrate to the Combined Development Agency of the United Kingdom and the United States, Rum Jungle operated until 1971 without the environmental controls mandated today. Over its working life, the mine extracted approximately 863,000 tons of uranium ore. Processing operations left open cut pits that flooded with highly acidic water, along with millions of tons of pyritic waste rock exposed to heavy monsoon rainfall. Oxidation of the sulfide minerals generated massive acid mine drainage, leaching heavy metals such as copper, nickel, and zinc into the adjacent east branch of the Finnis River. For decades, the river system downstream was declared biologically dead. Although Commonwealth and Northern Territory agencies launched major multi-stage rehabilitation programs to cap the waste rock dumps and isolate the acid water, the area around the former mine leases remains heavily monitored and closed to unrestricted entry, standing as a stark record of mid-century industrial extraction. Yet the open expanse of the northern scrub hides military installations that dwarf even these industrial footprints in operational secrecy. What lies buried beneath the central desert ranges, where electronic eyes track silent orbits across the hemisphere? Number 5 takes us into the McDonnell Ranges southwest of Alice Springs in the Northern Territory, to the Joint Defence Facility Pine Gap. Built under a classified bilateral treaty signed in 1966, the facility occupies a secure valley shielded by the surrounding quartzite ridges. What looks on satellite imagery like a cluster of more than 30 white geodesic radomes across a fenced compound is one of the most critical satellite control and signals intelligence stations on Earth. The facility operates as a ground control and downlink hub for geostationary satellites monitoring ballistic missile launches, radar signatures, and electronic transmissions across Asia and the Middle East. Jointly operated by the Australian Department of Defence and United States intelligence agencies, Pine Gap maintains a dedicated prohibited airspace zone designated R230, extending from ground level into the upper atmosphere. The entire surrounding ground perimeter is ringed by high-security double fencing, electronic motion sensors, and round-the-clock armed patrols. Unauthorized photography or entry carries severe federal penalties under the Defense Special Undertakings Act 1952, keeping its subterranean operations shielded from the public eye. Number 4 moves to the eastern coastline of Victoria, within the city of Greater Geelong, where the Australian Centre for Disease Preparedness operates on the outskirts of East Geelong. Formerly known as the Australian Animal Health Laboratory, this heavily secured Commonwealth scientific complex was commissioned by the CSIRO in 1985 at a cost of roughly $160 million. Engineered to research the world's most virulent and dangerous pathogens, the facility contains one of the Southern Hemisphere's few operational biosafety Level 4 high-containment laboratories. To guarantee total physical and biological isolation, the core complex is constructed as a massive, airtight concrete box within a box, maintained under permanent negative air pressure so that air only flows inward. Every litre of exhaust air passes through multi-stage, high-efficiency particulate air filters, and all liquid waste is sterilized using high-temperature thermal treatment plants before release. Scientists work in fully encapsulated positive pressure suits supplied with breathing air lines while handling lethal agents including Hendra virus, Nipah virus, avian influenza, and foot and mouth disease. The facility is protected by armed security, biometric airlocks, and strict physical access perimeters to prevent catastrophic biological exposure to the nation's livestock and human populations. Number 3 brings us to the arid plains of South Australia, roughly 170 kilometres northwest of Port Augusta, where the Woomera prohibited area spans 122,000 square kilometres. Gazetted in 1947 under the Anglo-Australian Joint Project, Woomera became the primary testing ground for long-range ballistic missiles, rocketry, and atmospheric weapons, including the Black Knight and Europa rocket programs. To track supersonic targets across thousands of square kilometres of scrub, Commonwealth engineers built a vast network of cinetheodolite optical tracking stations, radar arrays, and ballistic camera towers. Beneath the surface, the range holds unexploded ordnance, rocket debris, and classified trial footprints accumulated over 8 decades of live fire testing. It remains the largest overland military test facility on the planet, managed by the Royal Australian Air Force. While the Stuart Highway cuts straight across the range, stopping, leaving the road corridor, or entering the interior without an official defence permit is strictly forbidden. These exclusion zones were carved out by military necessity, but other landscapes were shuttered because of lethal geological traps and deep-seated structural hazards. Where on the eastern seaboard does the very rock beneath civilian ground present an invisible, volatile threat? Number 2 brings us to the Hunter Valley in New South Wales, situated directly between the townships of Wingen and Murrurundi within the Upper Hunter Shire. Here lies Mount Wingen, recorded on geological survey maps as the Burning Mountain. Beneath a barren, fractured hillside exposed to thermal cracking, a subterranean bituminous coal seam has been smouldering naturally for an estimated 6,000 years, making it the oldest known continuous coal fire on Earth. The combustion sits roughly 30 meters below the surface, advancing south at a measured rate of approximately 1 meter per year. Over millennia, the intense underground heat, reaching temperatures up to 800 degrees Celsius, has baked the overlying sandstone into hard, glassy, metamorphic rock and caused surface collapses across a designated exclusion reserve. The ground actively vents sulfurous gases, carbon monoxide, and steam through deep fissures. Because the heat hollows out voids beneath the topsoil, the New South Wales National Parks and Wildlife Service maintains fenced walking tracks and strict perimeter barriers. Walking off the designated elevated platform is prohibited due to the acute risk of sudden ground subsidence, hidden sinkholes, and lethal toxic gas venting. This continuous subterranean combustion illustrates the unpredictable nature of geological containment. Yet the most heavily restricted ground in the country is defined not by natural fires or industrial accidents, but by the ultimate security footprint of national defence and deep space communications. Number 1 takes us to the eastern seaboard of Western Australia, at the tip of the Northwest Cape near the town of Exmouth. Here stands Naval Communication Station Harold E. Holt, established under a joint treaty between Australia and the United States in 1963 and commissioned in 1967. The station occupies a vast coastal peninsula dominated by Area B, an array of 13 massive radio towers arranged in a hexagonal pattern known as Tower Zero. The central mast rises 387 meters into the air, making it one of the tallest structures in the Southern Hemisphere. The purpose of this colossal antenna array is very low-frequency radio transmission, operating at frequencies between 15 and 20 kHz. These extremely long radio waves possess the unique physical property of penetrating seawater down to depths of roughly 30 to 50 meters, allowing continuous encrypted command communication with submerged submarines across the Indian and Pacific Oceans without requiring them to surface. The facility operates at 1 million watts of transmission power, generating an electromagnetic field so intense that the entire surrounding area is locked down behind layered military checkpoints. Unauthorized civilian vessels are barred from entering the adjacent coastal waters, and entry into the high-voltage transmission sectors is strictly prohibited to prevent severe electromagnetic radiation hazards. Behind these guarded gates and exclusion zones lies a single unifying truth. Every square kilometer of forbidden ground across the continent represents a calculated choice to isolate an extreme physical hazard or protect a critical strategic system. How do these permanent exclusions reshape the way we understand the modern Australian map? What kept these vast territories invisible for so long was not a conspiracy or an active cover-up, but the simple habit of cartographic division, which treats a painted borderline on a map sheet as the natural boundary of what is known. When a territory is excised under defense legislation, mining leases, or emergency conservation orders, it does not cease to exist within the physical landscape. It merely ceases to generate public records. The physical consequences continue to evolve across deep time, regardless of the administrative perimeter drawn above them. At Maralinga, microscopic plutonium particles continue their 24,000-year decay through shifting arid dunes. Beneath the fractured sandstone of Mount Wingen, the coal fire advances silently southward meter by meter into untouched seams. And across tens of thousands of square kilometers of former testing ranges in South Australia and Western Australia, unexploded ordnance and residual contaminants remain locked in the topsoil, monitored by state and federal survey agencies whose baseline datasets are still incomplete. Large-scale remediation efforts run into hundreds of millions of dollars, yet definitive environmental containment in extreme arid environments remains an open engineering problem. The official cadastral map presents a neat, settled surface, but the ground beneath it remains active, hazardous, and unresolved. Which restricted boundary or unexplained site in your own state or territory has always stood out to you on the map? Tell us in the comments below, and subscribe for more deep investigations into the overlooked geography of the continent.